friends. Welcome back to the World Bank's Econothon. Thank you very much to all of our colleagues in Amman and across the Middle East and North Africa. Welcome back to Washington, D.C. I'm Valerie Hickey. I'm going to be your host this hour. We're entering the very final stretch of our economics marathon, though I sort of think we should probably call it an economics relay race, since we've been passing the baton back and forth between our field offices and ourselves, just showing you how much the World Bank really is a bank of the world. There's just 4 hours left before we hit our goal of discussing development economics non-stop for 24 hours, but there's still lots and lots of time to join the conversation. Please do use the hashtag Econothon or join us on Scribble Live. Quick time check. Right now it's 8 o'clock here in Washington, it's just afternoon in Accra, it's 1 o'clock in London, and it's 8 p.m. in KL. Everybody's on their way home from a long day of work. I'm going to be introducing some great discussions this coming hour. Here's a quick sneak peek of what we're going to be discussing. Start a discussion of something that is discussed at every kitchen table around the world and every cabinet table around the world, and that's the question of debt. This is a question we've been obviously talking about at the World Bank for a very, very long time. And I'm delighted to be joined by two of our best debt people who talk and think about debt on a daily basis. Marcello Estevao, who's our Global Director of Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment, and Evis Rucaj, who's a Senior Economist in our Development Economics Group. Marcello, let me start with you. We all talk about debt. We're all worried and scared about debt. Is debt just a bad thing?
No, not really. I mean, debt can be quite good depending on how you use it. Think about when you buy a house, for instance. You don't have all that cash in your account. So in general, you need to borrow to be able to buy the house on the spot, and then you have, 30 years to pay it back. So that's an example of a good debt. If the terms of the debt are good, if they are consistent, these terms to your, income in the future, so that's good debt. The same thing for countries. So if you are borrowing because whatever you get in terms of tax revenues is not enough for you to invest in schools and roads, and these are things that actually are going to make the country grow faster in the future. So if you're doing that, and again, the terms of the debt are reasonable, then it's very good debt. The problem in general happens when this is not the case, when you overborrow, when you overestimate your ability to repay. Same thing, what happened in the world 10 years ago with the debt crisis that was basically caused by over-indebtedness for households. That's when the problem starts. And for a country, the worst thing that you can have, one of the worst things that you can have, is to have a debt crisis, because then you have economic activity stalling, unemployment goes up. In general, the poor are the ones that suffer most. So being careful when you borrow is crucial.
And how do we know what a country's debt is? A lot of us don't even necessarily know our own debt. How does a country think about its debt? How do we know about it? Is there such a thing as debt transparency?
Yeah, this is a term that people use a lot. And think of transparency. Transparency is really what you see in the dictionary. It's the ability to see through something. Why is this good? Because if you have a very transparent account, so everybody knows how much you owe, the terms, first, the risk for a lender to lend to you goes down, because the lender knows, I know about everything about this country. Same thing for a person. You tend to get better terms if you are pretty open about your income, and the bank can really target the loan for whatever risk you have in your life. It's the same thing for countries. So the most transparent a country is, better terms probably you get. Of course, if you are in trouble, you may not be able to get financing, but that's another issue. That's why we at the World Bank work with countries to first make sure that, or at least help the countries to have the fiscal accounts in good shape, and also to be quite transparent on the terms, their rule books on what you should do, so that everybody knows what's your degree of indebtedness.
Evis, let me turn to you. What's the bank role? Marcello is talking about how we play a role with governments, helping them with their debt transparency as well as, of course, with managing their debt. How do we gather data about debt?
Right. So this goes back since 1951, when the bank started to lend to the countries for reconstruction and building their economy. And based on a mandate, operational policy 1410 of the bank, those countries had to report every detail of their debt obligation to the bank. And since then, bank compiles, collects, disseminates those data, and those data are being used for many reasons. The rationale for compiling those data in this format is twofold. Is operational, because the banks need to assure itself on the debt service capacity of the countries, as well as analytical. The bank usually uses those data to make better policies for those countries, to help them, assist them not to go and fall into debt crisis. This data has been, the outset of this data has been integrated as an integrated part on creditworthiness of those countries, macroeconomic analysis, debt sustainability analysis, the policies such as non-concessional borrowing policies for the bank, as well as numerous country-specific research, analysis, cross-country, income groups. So those data have been, because of the richness that they have been one of the foundation of many policies that the bank provides for those countries and the economies.
Is it public data? If I wanted to look up where my country is in terms of debt, can I look it up?
Yes, the bank has also have an annual publication as a public good. So this data, because of the way the profile the data is, the way of the uniqueness those data have been meeting a lot of demand internally, but as well as externally for the users. We have, through this public good publication, with a lot of analysis about the key development of those countries regarding the debt obligations, how those trends and developments have been increasing throughout the years, what are the factors behind it. We do the connection between the economic analysis, policies of those countries and the governments, how they affected this increase on debt and indebtedness, and as well as we initiate a conversation with the users and the public to focus on what we see better and to use the data at its best to a bigger picture. So the creditors, the lenders, the investors can see this data in a way that they can help countries to prosper and improve.
So Marcello, you see this data, you work with this data every day. How are we doing? Where is the world? Is there a debt crisis coming? Sometimes I worry, I read the newspaper and there's worries about a new financial crisis, a new debt crisis. Is there one? When you look at the data, what do you see?
Well, debt has reached a peak, a recent peak in 2017, that this last year that we have debt data for the whole world. And that's worrisome, no question. But debt crises are very hard to predict. And I wouldn't say that there is a debt crisis around the corner. I mean, many factors would have to come into place for that to happen. But we can't be complacent either. So it is true that some countries are in, and that goes for developed economies, developing countries, emerging markets. You see an increase in indebtedness in all these groupings. So some countries are in a delicate debt situation. So what we do with our main client countries, again, is basically working with them to work through the problem. The first issue is to make sure, like you joke, like I don't know how much debt I have. I mean, so to make sure that they know the extent of the problem. And we have missions to many countries that the World Bank economists work side by side with the authorities to build that database and have all the parameters just so. Then we work with countries to improve debt management. Because if you have very high debt, maybe there are things you can do that helps at least at the margin, but sometimes it's a real help to bring that debt down. Then we also work with fiscal institutions to make sure that they are doing economic planning in a way that's consistent with the true debt reality. So I would say that right now we are working case by case. We participate in all the major gatherings of international institutions, in the G20, G7. So we make sure that the voice of all our client countries are heard and the needs are, and also to basically advocate for better fiscal planning.
Marcello, we've got people obviously watching this from all around the world. Should any of them worry that if one of our client countries is having some trouble with debt, they're not in a good debt situation, that we're going to go in and say, you need to stop spending, you need to stop investing in education or healthcare? Should anybody worry that the bank is going to go in and start making things worse for the poor? You mentioned earlier that it's often the poor who suffer most when debt isn't managed well. Or do we still go in and make sure countries are investing where they need to build human capital and create opportunities for people to get into the middle class?
Yeah, in our engagement with the countries, we really make sure that the least protected people in the country get some level of protection. That is a priority. Development is about people at the end of the day. It's about jobs, it's about reducing unemployment. Development is not an abstract thing. It's not having a nice bridge. It is really make sure that people are living better. So that's a priority for the World Bank, and we focus on that. In the process of doing a fiscal adjustment, we help countries protect those type of spending and focus on things that they can really, even if it's quite important, but they can live without for a while. That's a very hard balance, but that's a commitment that the World Bank has.
So Evis, you have a very good sense of the historical data. You've been looking at this, not you yourself since 1951, because you're certainly not that old, but the bank has that data since then. What have you seen in the trends? What's the trend data telling us overall?
So anytime there is a financial crisis, post that, there is a lot of activity in borrowing and lending. And since last financial crisis, 2008-9, there has been a lot of increase in debt. So the high-income economies, because of some favorable factors, low interest rate, quantitative easing, consumption of the prices, goods prices, as well as more of the money going through the international market, has been lending to the low income, middle income countries a lot. But on the other side, parallel to that, the public borrowing portfolio has been changing quite a lot. The governments have more access to the international market to issue bonds, to refinance their debt, and those bonds are with not so beneficial advantages on interest rate and maturity and so on and so forth. But in the same time, the borrowing has been shifting from traditional multilateral, bilateral source of financing to non-traditional bilateral source of financing. And that is quite evident and growing persistently last 5 years. So there is always, those debt burdens and vulnerabilities have been raising the concerns of the international community. And this is how we see that, this debt has been expanding quite a lot recently, especially on the market.
And what about, Marcello, the difference between domestic debt and foreign debt? Does that make a difference to a country, or is debt debt no matter where it comes from?
It makes some difference, because if you owe a particular amount to some other person, but you don't have that type of currency, then you have to go one extra hoop to actually pay that debt. So it does make some difference, because these external transactions are done in general, say, in US dollars or in euros or in what we call convertible currencies. And in that case, this extra hoop sometimes is an issue if the country doesn't have enough foreign currency to pay its debt. And again, it can be an important hoop to jump, but that is that at the end of the day. It's an obligation that you have to pay back something that you owe. Sometimes actually domestic debt can be actually more complicated, because say the major banks in an economy are the ones that are holding that debt. And if you don't pay back, you can create a banking crisis. And maybe if you don't pay this foreign agent, it's something that happens outside. So what I'm saying is that both have their difficulties, and countries have to manage both, and we help them manage both. Like she said before, what is peculiar about this time around is that the environment has changed. It's not anymore the case that, say, least developed countries are borrowing just, say, from the World Bank.
Right.
No, they have access to market, interest rates are low, so the set of creditors that can sit around the table are big. We need a bigger table. So another role that the World Bank has is to coordinate somehow this negotiation. Sometimes happens because countries need help dealing with different sets of creditors.
So is the world very different today than when we had the discussions about debt relief for the HIPC countries, the heavily indebted poor countries many, many years ago? There's a lot of talk of debt relief. A lot of debt relief happened. Everybody talks about the Paris Club when it comes to debt. Is that world different now with the entrance of so much cheaper money on the markets and so many countries now being creditworthy and able to access that money? Or is it still very much about the Paris Club?
No, the world is quite different. That's exactly what we are talking here. We have other bilateral creditors that are not members of the Paris Club, for instance. Those are other countries that have high savings and they are rightly investing abroad. And the borrowing countries are right in taking those savings and applying to improve the infrastructure or the domestic situation. And that's quite different from say 10 or 15 years ago. And on top of it, we have, again, private banks. They have lent to these countries. We have export credit agencies who have insured lending from private banks to, say, a company to build a dam in a particular country. So the environment is more complicated, which makes more fun for me. It's a more fun job, but it's more work.
And in terms of changes, Evis, have you seen any changes in how we now gather the debt data or how we publish it? Or again, is it the same world? Are we doing the same thing that we did in 1951 today in 2019?
So there is always crisis happening. And after the crisis, it's always a discussion of there is a gap in the information, there are data not being represented or collected correctly. So there is a lot of criticism onto the data that international community has, users have, policymakers have. And for example, in post-crisis, Asian crisis in early 90s, late 90s, we had quite a lot of criticism on frequency of those external debt data by more detailed information on what are the instruments of those debt, what is the maturity, what is the hot capital flows versus the long-term one. So the bank has been very responsive towards those demands and from the users and decision makers. So in 2004, the bank jointly with IMF established a unified centralized database on quarterly external debt data. And that was quite a big revelation because these data are quarterly. They are more detailed on what is the sector that is actually borrowing, what is the debtor, rather than just the total of public and public guaranteed debt, and more debt instruments, what is the maturity, what is the short term, how much the government can afford to pay the short term, and so on and so forth. And that has been for all countries, all level of income, high income, low, middle income. And as of today, we have more than 140 countries reporting to this unified database.
And what's the frequency? I think, and Marcello, forgive me if I misheard you, but I think you said the last year we have good data from, or full data from, is 2015. So if 2017. Yep. So even if it's just 2017, it's 2 years ago, and given that things can change quickly, is that enough frequency? Can we help governments make decisions if we're basing that decision-making and our advice on data that's 2 years old?
So the quarterly data that we have so far is end 2018. The annual data is up to 17.
Okay.
So there are different type of databases that the bank has been working on in order to fill these gaps of the data so we can have faster decision making and faster policies to be implemented. So that was one of the post-financial crisis in Asia at the time. Similarly, in 2008-9, post-financial and global economic crisis, the bank again responded jointly with IMF to the demand for filling the data gaps based on the G20 initiatives and the G20 recommendations. So the bank led this recommendation on establishing a public sector debt, expanding not only to the external debt, but also domestic debt, which was another new thing that the bank stepped in and led, and still we are working to increase this reporting from those countries, especially the poor countries, and helping them to have a better capacity on reporting this data. And of course, the IMF and the World Bank together have been always working to set the standards and unify the methodology, definition of domestic debt, because sometimes it gets lost into
I can imagine.
definition. So, so far we have been working very closely also with the international community, bringing on board OECD, European Bank and Eurostat to get these countries together in this new establishment of the public sector debt.
So Marcello, I'm going to give you the last word. If there's one thing you're hearing from our clients when they talk to you about debt, what is it? And if there's one piece of advice you would give our clients, what is it?
Borrow wisely. Be careful on the quality of spending. This is really the key thing here. Why are you borrowing? And are you spending on things that after will allow you to pay back this loan? Are you really investing in the future of the country in a sensible way? I think that's really so. Are you building good schools and paying teachers a good wage so that they are going to teach our kids well, and then say 20 years from now they'll be productive members of society? And by the way, that debt that you incur to do that is a 20-year loan, because that's when these people can, raise productivity. Exactly. So I think the key here is have good spending plans and make sure that you are borrowing well. Fiscal institutions are key for that. So having good fiscal rules sometimes help as well.
And that sounds like wonderful advice, not just for our countries, but for all of us.
Yes.
And so friends, don't forget, balance your checkbooks and think about your debt. Borrow for investment, not for consumption. Marcello and Evis, thank you so very much for joining us this morning. It's a fascinating discussion and something that really resonates with a lot of people, particularly with all the news about debt management in the world. But of course, we're not just here, friends, to hear from our experts and ourselves. We want to hear from you. So here's a quick look at what you're all saying right now. Thank you, friends. We're joined again by our wonderful friend Zubida Robinson. Zubida, we just saw some of the things that people are saying online. What's really standing out to you right now?
You know, one that is really standing out and is relevant to the previous session is from Wellington Sihwa. He is saying, I want to know more about public debt management and the role the World Bank Group is doing in supporting sustainable growth and debt sustainability in developing countries. And Sendaula Noah says, while other strategies may help in kickstarting development in low-developed countries, my view is that until most of these countries are able to deal with the leadership question, progress and real growth are still a big dream. And then one that's interesting from Joe Abba, he says, great to listen to enlightening discussions about the future of work in Africa at the World Bank Econothon. Identify a problem, find the data around that problem, apply the data to solving that problem, and you have a business. He's quoting Kofi Datsi, a CEO of Rucaj, Ghana. And we found out, too, that Econothon was trending in Abuja.
Really?
Yes, so you keep those comments going with the hashtag Econothon, but also a quick status update on how our poll is doing.
Yes, what's the big issue that people is winning right now?
This is really fascinating. Jobs creation is ranking top at 225 votes, followed by climate mitigation and adaptation at 598 votes. And then health and education comes in third at 541 votes. Keep taking the poll. We'll be ringing in the final results towards the end of the Econothon.
And you know, I'd love to know the issue of jobs, the issue of climate. They're issues that young people in particular care about, people coming out of school who want to take that first step on the career ladder, and obviously, of course, thinking about what the world is going to be looking like in 2030, 2040, 2050 when they're older and start having their own kids.
Absolutely.
What is not trending so well right now? What are we seeing that people think is not the key issue?
Okay, this is an irony considering we've been talking about debt. Debt, which is one of the issues raised in the poll, is kind of struggling at 154 votes only. And then another one that is gender equality and inclusion is the lowest at only 106 votes. Come on, guys, you can do
Come on,
better.
everybody.
Keep taking
We
that
know
poll.
gender matters. This is a huge issue. Thank you, Zubida. But now I want to turn to an issue that I bet many of you don't know the World Bank actually cares about. And it is about road safety and traffic accidents, something that I imagine many of you, as we've been showing you behind the curtain of the World Bank, haven't thought is something we do a lot of thinking about. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Dipan Rose, who's a senior transport specialist. Dipan, you know, I've been very worried as I was doing some thinking about this segment, learning that almost 1.5 million people, 1.5 million people die every year in road traffic accidents. And for people in the prime of their life, prime of their working life, between 15 and 29 years of age, road accidents are the largest source of mortality and serious disability. So this is a serious, serious issue, and certainly one that I don't think gets enough attention. I know you've been working with Bloomberg Philanthropies, on a report that's looking at this issue and really thinking through what are the economic implications of this. Obviously there's human implications, but there's serious economic implications. What is the report finding?
Thank you. The results to begin with from this report have been staggering. So in this study, we looked at 5 countries. So there were India, China, Tanzania, Thailand, and Philippines. So in these 5 countries, if we are able to reduce road deaths and injuries by 50%, which is also the UN target, then there could be an additional increase in GDP per capita by up to 22% in 24 years. So it's long term, but that's almost the 1/5 of an economy.
So these are big numbers.
These are huge numbers.
And I know the report used a methodology that's been used to look at the economic implications of disease. So, you know, why did you take a look through the health lens? What is this helping you to, how is this helping you put the message out there?
So the main message is traditionally road injuries or accidents have been looked as an externality of transport. So more cars, more roads, traffic chaos, more accidents. But what truly road safety is, it is a public health issue. And it is no different than malaria, tuberculosis, or HIV/AIDS. So it needs to be treated as a public health burden. And in the health ecosystem, there have been questions raised on what is the socioeconomic impact of improving the health outcomes. But this has never been done for road safety. So we really saw this as an opportunity. And what it helps also for decision makers like the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury, is to objectively see road safety in the same way they see malaria, tuberculosis, or any other health burden that the country may be grappling with. And once they're informed about that, they can make the proper budget priorities. So coming back to the, the framing of the question, what the main, our interpretation from this report is that yes, road safety has an impact on the economic growth, But more than that, it is very closely linked to the human capital development. I mean, children cannot access education if they get killed on the way.
Oh, of course.
Productive age youths, they cannot contribute to the economy if we do not make sure that they lead a disability-free,
But Dipan, it's interesting. I mean, these numbers are staggering, and the report you've been working on is such an important one. And talking about and thinking about this as a public health issue is such a powerful lens. And yet, this is the UN Decade on Road Safety, and there's more and more deaths every year. It doesn't seem to be working. Why is our message not getting across? What are the economic factors that are stopping this message from being heard?
The biggest, I would say, among the economic factors is really the accountability and ownership of this problem at the top level. So this is about managing road safety. Now, what we see at the ground level, like roads in poor condition, cars that look dangerous, or victims who don't get treatment, or people not following traffic rules, these are all happening at the ground level. But there is a top-down approach which is missing. And behind this, there is also a lot of political economy. Now, for lack of demand from road users, there is a misconception that some of these interventions, road safety interventions, are politically not popular. Or also, a lot of politicians may also think that this is a price that comes with development. Like, yes, we are increasing, transportation.
It's quite a high price.
It is
1.5 million deaths a year.
And it's not only a high price, even that understanding is completely misplaced, because it's a avoidable situation. And this is the message that we have learned from other high-income or developed countries, which unfortunately have learned the hard way. Even decades back, when they were rapidly motorizing, their death rates were comparable to what the poor-performing countries have right now. So they have gone through that rise, and then when they got their act together, they have now, substantially reduced the numbers, and this is where our client countries need to move.
And getting their act together, what does this mean? I know conventional wisdom suggests that it's don't drink and drive, wear your seatbelt, slow down. If you're a pedestrian, cross at crosswalks. Don't be looking at your phone, which is something we all do, I think, when we're crossing the road. Is that enough? Is that what you're encouraging governments to invest in, these sorts of actions?
So that's a very interesting question. And yes, that has been the traditional way of looking at road safety. And it's true that every traffic crash will involve a driver. Every pedestrian-related incident will involve a pedestrian. But what is missing is looking at this problem for a completely different angle. And that's what ourselves at the bank, as well as the countries which have been successful, have adopted. It's called the safe system approach. So what is different about it? The safe system approach tries to create a forgiving environment with the underpinning and assumption that humans are prone to errors. They will make poor judgment. They will,
look at their phone crossing the road.
Engage in risk behaviors. So in spite of that, there is pure science in road safety which can minimize the risk of a serious injury or fatality to a very low extent. And that is what the safe system does. So yes, there will be people who will drive over the speed limit, but the infrastructure, for example, can be designed in a way that it is not physically possible to go beyond a certain speed.
And this is what the World Bank is doing on this issue. We're helping countries think through their system, think through their infrastructure, think through the regulation.
Yes, the World Bank, of course, has been a big advocate in this. And so one aspect is also to demonstrate that these road safety interventions can be implemented on ground. And this is what makes World Bank different from other global advocates. So we have, of course, we're supporting countries in terms of financing and advocacy. Now with the new environmental and social framework, for the first time, road safety is now a standard, right, which is mandatory for all bank finance projects. Outside of that, our infrastructure, vision that, yes, we are focusing on development and connectivity.
We can make this work.
yes, we.
Thank you so much, Dipan. I mean, this is a horrible epidemic, one that we don't talk about enough, and I really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues are doing to stop this. And friends, get off your phones when you're crossing the road. Slow down, don't drink and drive. But there's a lot more than that to do too. Thank you so much, Dipan.
Thank you.
Friends, from one report that really is about life and death on road traffic safety, I want to talk about next a different kind of report. This is our Doing Business report, something the World Bank has been doing for the past 16 years. It's about thinking through and helping countries compare across one another who's doing better at allowing businesses to be born and to grow. Here's a quick video that's going to show you exactly what doing business does. So we've just watched a video, but it's always better to get a 3D explanation from our experts exactly about what doing business is about. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Santiago Croci and Charlotte Jiang from our Development Economics team. Santiago, let me start with you. What is doing business about?
Well, doing business is about measuring how laws and regulations affect small and medium companies around the world, with the idea of promoting cost-efficient regulations and transparent that would boost the entrepreneurship in each one of our countries. The way that we do that is through an indicator set. We currently have 11 indicators in doing business that look at specific stages in the life cycle of a company. From the very beginning, with the starting a business indicator that look at things such as time, cost, and number of procedures needed to start a business, to the very end, we have an indicator on insolvency that looks at insolvency processes, how efficient they are, and whether or not the legal framework in that country is in accordance with international best practices. In between, you have 9 indicators that look at transactions that a company would have to do if it were to operate in the formal sector. So for example, a company will have to pay its taxes, so we look at how burdensome it is for companies to comply with its fiscal obligations. A company will have to hire workers, so we'll look at how flexible labor regulations are. And a company would most likely have to ask for a loan at some point, either to cover a debt or to expand, right? So we'll look at access to finance aspects of it. So 11 of those 10 indicators are what we do to compose the Ease of Doing Business rankings that comes every year in October. Here, I have to make a point that we don't measure all aspects that are relevant to the private sector development. We're asked to do this every time because there are things that we don't cover. For example, we don't cover the levels of security in a country. We don't cover the levels of infrastructure in a country. But we do believe that the 11 aspects that we cover are critical if you are to have a healthy business environment. And so that's what doing business does in a nutshell. And by extension, it is basically a benchmarking tool because each indicator has a case study with specific assumptions. So countries can look at the same transaction from one country to another, from one region to another. And they use it to improve. The indicators are relatively easy to understand. They're actionable. And so they use, that's the great thing about doing business, which is a benchmarking tool for all countries that the World Bank has as clients.
And every country likes to be higher on the index than
For
lower.
sure, that's
I know that
that's
one
for sure.
We're all competitive at heart. Charlotte, how do we collect the data? I mean, this is a huge amount of work to do every year. Where do we get the data from? How do we make sure it's good and robust?
That is a very important question because data collection is key to the doing business project. Now, Santiago mentioned that the report looked at 11 different areas of business regulations that matters for domestic SMEs. And the underlying data for those 11 areas of indicators are collected through 4 sources of information. The respondents, local experts that practice in these areas and fill the doing business questionnaires, the applicable laws and regulations, the government of those countries, and the World Bank Group regional colleagues. First, doing business has a very large network of local experts. So over the past 16 years, we have collected data from 34,800 of local experts. Wow. Those are a lot. And many people work with doing business for multiple years. In the last year alone, we collected data from more than 13,800 local experts. They are selected based on their areas of expertise because doing business look at regulations and laws. So many of our respondents are legal professionals. Those are lawyers, judges, notaries who look at legal proceedings such as how to protect minority investors, how to resolve a commercial dispute. We also work with a lot of people in other professions. For example, we collected data from tax consultants, tax accountant, freight forwarders, electrical engineers, and architects in areas such as how do companies pay taxes, get an electricity connection, get a construction permit, and export and import. We also collect data from some public officers. So, for example, the registrars in the company's registry and the property registry. We interact with all these wide network of respondents through multiple rounds of interactions every year. We send them questionnaires and collected the completed questionnaires. We have conference calls to discuss technical issues. We also visit countries every year. I think on average, every year we visit more than 30 countries.
Wow.
36 this year.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. And since February to now, it's that number of countries that we have visited. I mentioned that we also look at the laws and regulations because when respondents answer our questions, they also point us to the applicable legal basis. And we have a group of lawyers who have a very detailed readings of the laws and regulations and to make sure what the contributors told us are accurate. We also openly invite inputs from the government and the World Bank country offices that worked on the different reforms and issues in all the 190 economies that we cover, so that we make sure every year we use a holistic approach to capture all the information necessary for the doing business report. Our data collection period is from February to July every year. So now we're at the end of July. We're finalizing the next report, which is a Doing Business 2020 report. We'll launch it at the end of October this year.
So this really isn't a desk review. This isn't something you're doing by Googling some data. This is really crowdsourced and made robust. And you really go to the countries and they're providing you the data, the experts, the people who are living with the results.
From the private and public sector, it's a big point to make. We listen to both sides of the coin.
And Santiago, what's the most important thing in your mind when it comes to the period after July, after you've collected the data, to produce the report?
Well, after July, producing the report involves more codification. It's more the internal work that we do in our team. But if I had to highlight one aspect that I think is particularly important when producing a report like Doing Business is actually to ensure that it's a proper channel of communication with our client countries. Having scores, having a ranking is a blessing. To be honest, every time we publish, there is a lot of media attention. There is a lot of media attention from governments, from the private sector, for academia. So it's a great thing to have, but also it brings a lot of scrutiny into the data. Obviously, independently of where you are in the rankings or what your score is, people will question what we're publishing. They will say, well, okay, how you come with this? What are you really measuring? But we thought we were different, right? And so we need to make sure that there is some sort of capacity building involved every year, every time that we're collecting data. So to give you an example, since November that we published DB19, we've had more than 100 video conferences with around 70 countries. We had 51 delegations coming to DC to meet with the team to understand what their data is, to explain what reforms they're doing. And some of those delegations were 40, 50, 60 people coming. Wow. So it's really, you can see the dedication that governments have and the attention that they put into this report. As Charlotte mentioned, we traveled to countries. We traveled to 36 countries this year to collect the data on the ground, but in most of them we had workshops. So again, to engage, to explain what we're doing with the private sector, with the public sector.
So it's much more than a score. It's about capacity building and helping them understand how they can do better.
Exactly. I mean, for a research unit from DEC and from the bank, I must say that we must be one of the units that has more client-facing engagement throughout the year. Even if not in person, even in writing, we respond to all the queries that we get on the data. So on average, every year we respond to around 120 countries.
Do we ever make a mistake in the data?
We can, I mean, no one is perfect. Right. I mean, there are corrections that we make every year. I think there is no economic measurement that really is infallible. And we do have around 5% of the data that is corrected every year, more or less. But in general, I think that we tend to be pretty good at our assessment. So,
and we're
I imagine that's why, I imagine this transparency and the fact that you've been able to do this for 16 years and people take it so seriously suggests that people have a real faith in this. Charlotte, what have you seen in this past 16 years in terms of the impact of the report, given that people really see this as something that's very important, very transparent and very robust?
Well, it's a really good question. That's a question that we study every day. So 16 years ago, Doing Business was founded on the principle that economic activities can benefit from clear and coherent rules. And those rules spur growth and development the best when they are transparent, accessible, and also very streamlined and efficient. Over the past 16 years, thousands of researchers have used Doing Business report and Doing Business data to study that principle and to understand the impact of business regulations on different economic outcomes. One of the most studied area in Doing Business is the regulation to start a business. So it's like people like you and me who has a brilliant idea, and whether we can translate that into a business that's profitable and that can lift people out of poverty and improve their lives. There are a lot of research in this area, and all the body of research has pointed to the fact that excessive regulation in the firm's entry would increase the informal number of businesses and informal employment. But countries reforming this area, in Mexico and Portugal, for example, the government simplified the business registration, and following those reforms, there are a higher number of formal business startups and formal waged employment. Another area that's very important to companies is the ability to export and import, to import the elements that you need and to export your products. And there are a lot of studies looking at that issue using the Doing Business data to look at the impact of high trade cost on the country's performance in export and import. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where the ability for companies to export the agriculture and other products are so important to people, studies have shown that increasing transit time would reduce export. And also similarly, a delay in the custom clearance process is also found to negatively impact firms' abilities to export. So these are just few examples to show you how powerful the Doing Business study is and how useful the data are
and
to
Charlotte,
spur reforms.
Have you seen any, over the past 16 years, have you seen any general progress in the trends that there are certain indicators, whether it's entry of firms, whether it's about import-export, that are getting better across the board? Or is it really very different in different countries?
Well, generally we see very strong trend in all the areas covered by the Doing Business. I think take starting a business, for example. When we just started, more than 100 countries, it would take more than 20 days to start a business. Now that number has been significantly reduced. 16 years ago, many more countries would require minimum capital for people to start a business. So you have to have some cash reserves in order to turn your brilliant idea into a business operation. But now many countries has either reduced or entirely abolished that requirement. So we do see a lot of reforms that governments are implementing that have translated into our data.
And Santiago, how do you see governments using this? So when the report comes out every October and November, how does it influence policy making and decision making? Does it influence it? Yes. You know, we talk about governments taking this very seriously, but what do they do with it?
Well, actually, I think that, as in my personal opinion, when doing business came out, it was, I think, a kind of a game changer for policymaking. I think it came a little bit ahead of its time, really, in a way. Nowadays, it's very common to see in all aspects of our lives, rankings, ratings,
Right.
top 100 in business, in the entertainment industry, hospitality business. You'll see it, and people are drawn to it. They are drawn to it because it conveys a simple message.
Right.
It holds people accountable, and you can clearly see if something is a progress is happening. In the case of governments, it's the same way. Governments are composed by people, and people are held accountable, and they react to that, right? And so one thing that we have seen in 16 years of publication, we have recorded more than 3,500 business reforms. About a third of those were directly inspired by doing business, more than 1,100, meaning that someone in the government sat, read the report, looked at the data and said, okay, we need to change this, and we need to make things better. So that's on a more general scope, but at the granular level, what we're seeing, and which is really interesting, is that in order for you to improve in an indicator, because the way they are composed and constructed, you need to bring different agencies to the table to brainstorm. And a lot of governments, when they meet with us, regardless of what they think about the result and what they have, the one thing that they all agree on is, you know what, now we have this ministry, that agency, that the central bank in the table that they didn't used to talk to each other, but they're now talking to each other, trying to understand how to improve things. And and this is just the beginning, because what we're seeing is in countries, last year we saw what we call DB reform committees, which is this type of meetings that happen with different agencies to improve our rankings in more than 70 countries.
Wow.
Yeah, and what we're seeing is that for countries that have been doing this over time, the beginning is doing business, but then they start working on reforms that are beyond our scope. And this is a great thing to see, because then it's opened the door to improvements in many areas beyond our report, where even the bank itself gets engaged. And I think that's a very positive thing in terms of policy making, something that I don't know if it happens so often or regularly before the existence of the report.
And is the audience just government? Is it just these sorts of standing committees, or are we also really trying to speak to the everyday man and woman to show them what their governments are doing?
Well, a few things. So yes, the main audience is either government officials or researchers, because they use the data, obviously, for research purposes. But the way the report is written, I think, and this, Charlotte, correct me if I'm wrong, the language is simple. We try to keep it simple so that people understand what we are measuring, what the data itself entails. And if I'm from Uruguay, so as a Uruguayan citizen, I like to have this information on the table. It's upon me also to understand what I'm reading, right? But it's very useful for me if I want to open a business in my country to know, okay, these are the agencies that I have to go to. This is going to take me X amount of time, independently if the time itself then varies according to my experience, but it gives me a sense of how things are going. So yes, definitely for the private sector, for the men and women there with good ideas, it's important.
Charlotte, do we ever worry that, like you were saying, if you have a brilliant idea and you want to create a business, but all of a sudden I read the Doing Business report and I think, oh, it's going to take me 40 days to open this business, and it's going to be very difficult compared to all my neighboring countries to do business here because of the export rules. Do we ever worry that when some of our private sector clients read this, that they may worry that in fact this will slow them down from doing business in a country or make them move to another country?
Well, not at all. On the contrary, what we see is that when our readers read this report, and when a lot of news agencies and media outlets pick up the numbers and pick up the data from our report, this is the opening of dialogue to reforms. And very often the government would use our report and also engage all the users and private sectors and practitioners in the society, and to ask them, so tell us, why do our country not perform as well as our neighbors? What are the obstacles that you face in your day-to-day operation? Is this the tax procedure is very complicated, so it's very hard for you to understand the tax laws? Is it that the transport for export product is very long? Or whether it's a custom clearance, what are the obstacles? So that's when the conversation starts. And we see, as Santiago mentioned, a lot of reform committees formed and study groups formed to look at Doing Business report and to try to improve their countries. And people are very proud
So
of
it's the
that
start
process.
of a conversation.
It's the start of a
It's not the end of the
conversation. Absolutely is.
conversation.
At all. No, it's really the beginning. And what we see is that sometimes even the chambers of commerce or private entities will reach out to the government and say, okay, look, moving to a different country is not as simple as one might think. So you might want to deal with the problems that you have in your own and try to make things better. And this was something that we're seeing. And when I say the reform, we mentioned this DBA reform committee. In many countries, they're public and private sector involved, so that the dialogue is there. And
That's fantastic.
That's a positive. Yes.
So I know you can't tell us anything yet. You haven't crunched any of the numbers on Doing Business 2020, but I know we're all going to be super looking forward to seeing these numbers come out in October, November. What was the biggest surprise for both of you in the Doing Business 2019? Was there any country that really ran up the rankings?
Well, there were many. I think it was a year of records. We had a record number of reforms, 314 reforms in 128 economies. We had countries that made huge progress for at least one of the first time in our measurement. For example, China got in the top 50. That's something that a big jump. You know, India continued doing strong work in our areas. We have little countries like Djibouti that still continues to improve their business environment. I think they were for a second year in a row in the top improvers list of doing business.
Wonderful.
So yes, I mean, every year we have, I think, good stories to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have countries from every region that improve a lot, countries that are big and small. So reform is really not in a certain club, it's for everyone and every country.
Was there anything in the report last year that made you a little bit worried? Anything you saw where the trend was not quite so positive?
Well, all regions progressed in a positive way, but if I had to say one thing, is that the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, compared to the others, are reforming less and less often. We see record number of reforms in Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia continue to be the top two regions that have the most initiative, more reform per countries. Obviously, OECD high-income economies are actually pretty active, but not as much because the needs are not the same.
Fascinating.
But in comparison with that, we see that, you know, although there are some improvements here and there is no consistency in Latin America, and this is something that we would like to see changing in the future.
But basically, you're both hopeful and optimistic. After 16 years of this, and we'll have another at least 16 more years to go, you think things are just getting better and better.
We hope so.
We're
This
going
we hope
strong.
so. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Charlotte, Santiago. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. And everybody, please do watch out. October, November, the new Doing Business 2020 is going to be released. It's going to be a stunner. This is a must-read report. Honestly, it's a fascinating, easy way to understand and to help you think through if you want to be the next business, if you want to be the next Google, if you want to be the next mom and pop store in your community. This is a wonderful report to think through how to do it and how to do it best and how to talk to your government about improving how they do business. That's the end of yet another hour of this economics marathon. From Washington, D.C., we've been delighted to have you all join us. We've got 3 hours to go. We really are in the final sprint of this marathon. Stay engaged, stay tuned. We're going to be handing over now to our friends in Europe and Central Asia to give them a chance to show us the fantastic solutions that they've been testing and that they've been developing to solve the problems that they're too having in that part of the world. But do stay engaged, stay tuned, there's lots more to come.